The 20th of November marks what some would consider to be a special day in the trans calendar. The LGBT community in general has many pseudo-public holidays, usually on topics like awareness or coming out. But not to be outdone by their fellow LGBT comrades, the trans community has their own special day, Trans Day of Remembrance. So what is this day, I hear you ask? After all, I'm guessing a lot of my viewers aren't actually trans, and are surprised to hear of what must be yet another date for virtue signalling. According to those who mark it, Trans Day of Remembrance was set up to remember the lives of all the trans people who have been murdered due to transphobia over any given year. Vigils are set up by numerous LGBT groups or those who consider themselves allies. Heartfelt opinion pieces are written for woke publications, and outpourings of grief can be found across social media platforms that haven't yet been shut down. In turn, the deaths which are remembered are used to highlight just how hard life can be for trans people, whether they be in the UK or the USA. Owen Jones used the occasion in 2016 to browbeat on how we live in a society where trans people face prejudice and discrimination on all sides. Brighton and Hove's Green Party referenced Stonewall's controversial suicide statistics, and professional trans person Ros Kavanagh once wrote a poem on the day on how any of the deaths noted could have been her. Yes, any one of them. I'm sure from the tone of my voice you might have already picked up on my thoughts of this particular holiday, so let me make it clear. Trans Day of Remembrance is bullshit. And here's why. To figure out the problem with Trans Day of Remembrance, or TDOR, we need to consider two things: what the narrative is, and what the statistics used from the TDOR website actually say. We're told the day is to honour trans men, women and non-binary people who have been murdered due to transphobic hate crimes over any given year. We're also told the victims are primarily people of colour. And finally, that this is a reflection of the society we live in, even here in the UK, as virtually every piece written on the subject devolves into discussions of trans rights in general. How accurate is all this? Let's take a look at the statistics on the TDOR site between 2014 and 2018. Why start at 2014? Well, that's the last time a trans murder in the UK was recorded on the list until this year. So, within a 5-year period, from 2013, when Jacqueline Cowdroy was murdered, to 2018, with the death of Naomi Hersey, there have been 2 trans-related murders in the UK over this period. And if we're to consider whether this counts as an epidemic of attacks on trans people, this would only be relevant if trans people were to make up a tiny minority of the UK's population. According to Stonewall, though, that's not the case. They've claimed trans people make up 1% of the UK's total population. So, statistics-wise, we're talking 2 out of around 600,000. This is such a small fraction that it's barely worth noting. It's about 0.0003%. In fact, more cyclists are killed yearly, roughly 0.1% of all cyclists. So by the standards set forward by TDOR, if there is an epidemic of trans deaths, then cyclists are experiencing genocide by comparison. Similarly, trans deaths across Europe remain low. In this year's list, there were 2 deaths in France, 3 in Italy and 1 in Spain. You can add an additional 7 if you consider Turkey as part of Europe, although you'd need to acknowledge that there is a vast cultural difference between it and the EU nations I've already mentioned. But even a cursory glance at any year's list will show you the vast majority of the deaths are located in one part of the world, South America. Or to be more specific, Brazil, a country with an extremely high rate of violent crime and a homicide rate of between 30 to 35 per 100,000 people. Brazil regularly dominates the list, with other South American nations such as Colombia, El Salvador and Venezuela, which have some of the highest murder rates on the planet by the way, boosting the figures. But these are also countries with political instability and high levels of organised crime, circumstances almost unique to that continent by comparison with the rest of the world. And it's important to note that the list TDOR uses only provides the causes of death, but never indicates any motives other than transphobia. Quite frankly, it's impossible to determine why these people were murdered as there's so little information. Now, I'm not doubting any trans prejudice may have been a factor, but Brazil in particular has issues with crimes against sex workers, not just trans women, but all women who regularly face physical abuse. It's regularly indicated many of the trans women who have been murdered were sex workers. So doesn't this say more about the plight of prostitutes in Brazil rather than against trans women in general. Outside Brazil, Mexico is ranked the second deadliest place to be trans, but again, this is a country with soaring murder rates. It's not outside of logical reasoning to conclude that countries with high amounts of murder already don't necessarily indicate to them being dangerous places just for trans people. So which country would be most comparable to the UK in terms of culture? In all honesty, it would be the United States, but that's a country with more than 18 times the amount of murders already. And again, the deaths are generally located in cities with high crime rates. Naomi Hersey may have been murdered in London, which has seen a rise in violent crime since Sadiq Khan took over as mayor, but this doesn't compare to Chicago, which had the highest amount of trans women deaths this year. But what about the racial aspect? After all, TDOR makes a point that the vast majority of deaths are trans women of colour. But does it really count as of colour when the deaths are taking place in countries where the race of the individual is reflected in the majority? I can understand the arguments in America somewhat, but again, the motivations of each death remain unclear. Can we really say they were killed because of white supremacy or transphobia if the individual was mugged? We don't even know the perpetrators of the crime, so we can't presume anything. What I'm highlighting is that the areas with the highest amount of trans deaths already have major problems with violent crime. You cannot simply compare Brazil or El Salvador to Europe when it comes to levels of crime, and it's frankly dishonest to do so. So with all that being said, who is the day really for? I've looked at where the deaths took place, but how do the victims compare to those who mourn? For one, the list is heavily weighted with one particular part of the trans demographic, which is trans women. Trans men, and especially non-binaries, have little to no representation year on year. In fact, the only NB death I can find in recent times last year was where the list labelled someone who had lived as a woman until they detransitioned when living on the street. They labelled them as non-binary, feeling almost like a token gesture to MBs to make them feel included. 2 other deaths last year don't appear to be related to trans people at all, as they were just men dressed as women on nights out. So not even self-IDing as trans in the first place. What the statistics tell us is that trans men and NBs are not represented amongst the dead in any significant matter. They have the least relation to anyone murdered. So what about trans women? The only thing the average trans woman mourner in the UK would have in common with the dead is that they're both trans women. My experiences of life are going to be completely different to that of someone in Brazil. There's very little social cohesion between us. Unless you're a trans woman sex worker who lives in some of the most dangerous countries in the world, there is no connection. Ros Kavanagh may have written a poem where she says any of the deaths could have been her, but unless she was street crawling in the favelas of Rio, I'll remain sceptical. But Rose, what's wrong with people wanting to pay their respects to those who died? Why does it matter if they have no connection? Surely it's a good thing that they are being remembered, you big meanie. Well, Jenny, it's because it's a pity party. We hear the same rhetoric every year, that trans people are repressed, that every day we face violence, aggression and even death, that any one of us could be the next victim of transphobic murder, whether it be myself or an NB who hides out at a queer safe space to play board games on TDOR. And to back all this up, death statistics from countries with already high murder rates are paraded as though they are in any way relatable, and people shed tears for others they have literally no connection to. Does this not seem off to anyone? And what's more, it feels like it's the one day of the year where social justice rhetoric has a day off. In current year, we're being constantly told what is problematic. Haircuts, clothing, food, words, all of it's considered appropriation if you're white. And yet, TDOR exists. When people who have zero connection to anyone who suffered, who aren't sex workers, who don't live in dangerous countries, who aren't even trans women, use literal experiences of others and say that this is a reflection of their own lives somehow. It could have been me. But it won't be you, will it? None of this would be you. You live in a country where, like it or not, trans people are free from persecution, where there isn't violence every night. But despite this, you have the nerve to pretend that somehow all of this is universal? That a Brazilian sex worker's death means we need to debate bathroom or prison rights? There's no through line here. There's only one day in November that is worth remembering. Armistice Day is important in our culture because it recognises those who have served their country, fought and lost their lives in both world wars and beyond, those who made the ultimate sacrifice. It's worth remembering because these wars touched every corner of the UK. A great many of us have relatives who were directly involved. I know I do in my family. My great uncle was a Spitfire pilot in the Battle of Britain. These sacrifices made by brave individuals impacts us to this very day. And most of us know that people who are serving or have served their country even now. Armistice Day is not for politicising, it's just for remembering. But Trans Day of Remembrance does not have that same impact. There is no connection, and deaths of people you don't know are used for political point scoring in lands they had nothing to do with. I am not saying that none of these deaths are a tragedy. Far from it. Every time somebody is murdered, it is wrong. I thoroughly disagree with any kind of violence, but it is being used to push an agenda worldwide. You are taking advantage of people who have died in other countries to suit your own goals and to virtue signal as though you are somehow a better person than I or anyone else because you're shedding tears for people you do not know, have never known, and will never be in any kind of situation like them whatsoever at any point in your damn lives. TDOR, get fucked.